It's going to take a second for him to get the slides because he had to convert them from PDF.
Fair enough, yes.
So you can fill some time.
Okay, perfect. I could use the extra few minutes. I have the challenging task today of covering a lot of ground in the energy sector and sort of how blockchain applies to it. I'm a metaphor guy as well, so they'll have to bear with me as I get through a few of those today. But I think the overarching metaphor for this presentation is we're going to have to touch just the tip of the iceberg in a few sectors or a few sections of the energy sector and economy. And the energy sector is so complex that we really have to hop skip through maybe like 20 iceberg tips. So we're going to have to hop around a bit, and we're going to do it pretty quickly. I assume that these presentations will be available afterwards. If you want a copy, just shoot me an email. This was me 5 years ago. I came from an energy systems background. We were doing a lot of EPC work for energy systems in the Virginia, Maryland, and DC area. And then about 5 years ago, I started doing lead research for some NGOs that were looking to try and heal some fragmentation that had occurred across the Energy Star network. And then 3 years ago, we founded Ledger, and we were Energy Star Contractor of the Year last year in 2018. So in one universe and out the other, or across many different icebergs. Crypto economics is a fascinating subject for me, and to actually quote Langdon, data must be filtered in order to become good information. And right now in the energy sector, there's a lot of communities that exist to make different portions of the energy sector function, and most of them are not collaborating on data that unites them, even though they agree that a certain type of data is useful for them as competitors to drive an economy. Much of them is, most of them are stovepipe from each other or firewalled from each other, and there's not necessarily consensus in terms of how to make a market out of the data in which they collaborate. And then finally, a lot of my passion is around Energy Star residential programs, which do a lot of energy efficiency or solar or health and comfort improvements in homes across the nation. And sadly, a huge chunk of that data is just evaporated into thin air after a program is finished and or even after a project is finished. So I want to talk a bit at the end here about all sorts of automation and algorithms and marketplaces that could exist for those who validate or collect or own the data about their house or about the project in their house. And then, I hate to say it, but we have 70 slides to just flip through, most of which is just describe how certain sectors of the economy aren't in collaboration. And then, Eugene, thank you for doing one of the best intros on blockchain ever. I will be able to skip a little bit of that in the middle of my slide deck here. So sort of the first section here is energy efficiency improvement projects there in the center. And there are just all these co-benefits, not just energy efficiency that comes out of a particular project. Really health and depending on the area of the world that you're going to talk about, all these other things in terms of well-being and poverty and employment and pollution. And in the US, the concept of manufacturers of construction products and healthcare in its own right in terms of preventative care capital. The cost of bolting a railing in an elderly home and the chance of reducing a slip and fall accident, it's $15 spent but might save the public health care system hundreds of thousands of dollars or save someone's life downstream. So how do you value this stuff? And if you can value it, how do you track it? And if you're going to install it, how do you, verify that it was installed correctly? And if you verify that it's installed correctly, how do you track who owns the rights and benefits and so forth from those types of projects? So policy, we have a few slides here just on what energy efficiency, kind of coming from that perspective, how it comes around and how there's a lot of hands on the hips talk from very major organizations still. Everyone has a lot of great ideas, and disruption being the main theme of this conference, I empower everyone here to take good ideas and actually get them into the real world. And in the energy efficiency space, I hate to say it, there's more talk than there is necessarily change. But why isn't change happening, and why aren't new types of investors connectable to the problem? Carbon war room slide here, a lot of discussion about markets or mandates or reparations. How do you get that money parsed out into the economy on a micro project basis? How do you fix all the Flint, Michigan water filters through the verify and quality assurance-based network that already exists in that area. There's this decoupling of problem with investment that is the theme that you're going to see in the next handful of slides. Data validation there was another thing on that back slide, and it kind of comes into cryptoeconomics and builds on Eugene's discussion there, is that, again, information that is well structured and well validated and well verified can have some value. And really in the energy sector, different types of projects and different types of programs not only try and value the project, but in order to track it and pay for it and make a market out of it, you need to know who owns the rights to the project or who owns the certificates and like all these other sort of intangibles that are related to any particular project. And then secondly, on sort of programmatic approaches in the energy sector, the government's been the one that stands a lot of these things up. And so this has created a boom and bust cycle. And really, an Energy Star rebate program is born through some pretty aggressive partisan politics on a state-by-state basis. It's a hard-fought thing, and figuring out how to fund or pay for that program is either a tax or it's built on a whole slew of ratepayers and then accessible to those that may qualify differently later. But it's not accessible to Fortune 100, Fortune 500 type of companies, which will at the very end kind of be the hook, line, and sinker of this presentation. So getting the government out of the way of creating new programs, or at least creating new funding vehicles for programs, is a big passion of mine, mainly because if you can't do repetition, which you see on this slide, then you've got workers and businesses going out of business on a very short cycle, 2, 3, 4 years for any one particular Energy Star program before its mandate or its funding has necessarily come to conclusion. And if there's not a renewal of that policy, or if there's not a renewal of funding, then the program disappears, all the data that was in the program disappears, and all the workers that were trained on that data also disappear. We'll talk a little bit about like the amount of money in these things too, and the amount of dollars that go into rebates, and the pennies out of that dollar that actually go to the rebate versus standing the program up and the administration of the program and training new workers in the program and so forth. So seeing this boom and bust cycle is extremely expensive, and then there's no continuity for companies, and makes small business ownership rather difficult. Another slide here, talking about financial institutions and bankable projects that need to connect towards fairly complex types of simulations and data sets that come from auditors or workers or quality inspectors and so forth. This is an AEC-EEE slide. Again, this is how do you develop energy efficiency policy, and everybody's talking about the rules and not so much about how to create a market mechanism that can connect all these rules to things. This is from the UN, United Nations COP24. This was just 2 months ago, and this is a slide from their agenda. And you see that transparency and market mechanisms and technology frameworks are kind of pointed at with those arrows, but that's the amount of time spent on just talking about those things. Okay, we're like, again, hands on hips here in terms of this thing. This is from the EU 2050 group. You've got some things highlighted here. People have the power, and in sort of my viewpoint, I think that citizens should be able to control their own data and whether they want to make it unprivate in order to participate in new types of certificate or markets or algorithms. But by default, you should be private, and if you want to participate, you should be able to make your data visible. And then value, starts with collaboration, and then focus on mechanisms and other kinds of things that they're talking about here. Same thing from International Energy Association, talking about policy and implementation. The closest thing they have to talking about how to create a marketplace for what they're doing is provide institutional assistance. But again, the market needs to be open, and there needs to be a framework so that real projects can be connectable to investors of different types. And EM&V stands for measurement and verification, and that's in a very expensive, building on Eugene's first presentation, that the auditing of a project's effectiveness is quite expensive. How do you verify 2016's energy efficiency data? And that costs millions of dollars by regional program. Again, this is a carbon market in this case. As I mentioned, the energy sector is very broad. You've got the transmission of energy, you've got the distribution of different types of certificates within it, you've got carbon, and then also on the slide you saw from Eugene that all of the use cases that IBM is tackling, insurance and healthcare and supply chain, Energy is the underlying thing for all of those things. So it is not only complicated, but it's also complex in how much it touches other sectors. Now we're going to kind of get into a bit of the fragmentation that exists. This is renewable energy certificate tracking. If you're a Wall Street banker and you want to do some sort of nationwide thing, guess what? You can't really do that very easily. You got to participate in all these different groups. Also, these tracking systems are somewhat antiquated in that they are based on contractor-reported data. Only a few of them are moving towards, actual performance-based data. The interoperability between one certificate and the next, from one region to the next, isn't quite there. Efficiency markets aren't in existence yet. This is what solar is doing, or wind certificates are doing. Efficiency as a concept, or home health as a concept, doesn't have a backdrop of certificate things like this. This is a bit about EM&V, measurement and verification. It takes 2.5 to 3 years just to measure 1 year's effectiveness. And it costs millions of dollars from a big consulting company. This is from European Energy Association. Citizen science, and kind of skim through here and talk a bit more about the fragmentation. And what we need to be able to enable is micro markets. So macro markets is one concept, but we need to be able to get specific measures into specific homes and specific climate regions. And we need to be able to track who did it and who funded it, and then who owns the residual rights to that project. And then, also, if you have such fragmentation, we haven't seen a lot of national-based financing efforts. And so why isn't that the case? Well, it's not worth the squeeze, quote unquote, for a Wall Street bank to try and go county by county by county and to develop some sort of micro program when ideally a more nationalized backdrop could exist. So this is kind of from my first career. I think this is a 2010 slide. Actually, it's kind of old, but it's not just if the home was built to Energy Star, but to really truly monetize to manufacturers and advertisers and all these other stakeholders, you need to know what components are inside of it, and you need to know how it was built. You need to know who verified that it was built correctly, and then you can start connecting people that value that information back to someone else. You also notice that not every state has a program. So now we're 40 plus years into the Energy Star program, and only 2/3 of the U.S. have an active rebate program. Again, rebate programs birth after protracted partisan political battle, and there's still arguments as to whether things are taxes or not on ratepayers, and again, why isn't this more of a national thing? There is sort of some national aspects to it, in as much as the DOE has spent a lot of time and money on guidebooks and handbooks and can help set up a sponsor in a particular region. But just having a sponsor in a region that doesn't have any financial or economic incentive for people to report data falls usually flat on its face, because why should a contractor spend an extra hour or two to report a project if there's no financial incentive for them? So rebates and incentives are a very useful way to get data into registry type systems, but then the same question exists as who's going to fund that type of incentive. All right, this is a bit more about the Energy Star program. Where is funding coming from? Taxes versus the RPS. The RPS is an important concept. That's the renewable portfolio standard that every state has for the most part, and there's different goals in that renewable portfolio standard. Maryland, for instance, has a 1 cent per kWh surcharge on all of its citizens, and all that money goes into funding a $90 million pool of incentives, and that pool kind of gets broken down in different public-facing programs. But if you're a lower moderate income homeowner, you might not have the $2,000 to match what the program funding requires. So it's kind of, again, being born on the backs of all citizens, but only accessible to a few. And then some really disgusting numbers here on the left side. 700 million reported projects in 2017, actually, probably, not 2018. 350 million of that was matched with rebates paid on top of that. And then 250 million was the cost of measuring and verifying the prior year's data and administering the new programs. So basically, if you raise $90 million in Maryland, you're only seeing 30 to 50 cents on the dollar going into rebates. Total of 110 homes in the U.S. Home performance plus the weatherization network under the DOE has been running for 40 years and has touched 8 million homes only. And really only the last 2 to 7 years spent on the area has a home been kind of aggressively gone after in terms of energy efficiency. So there's still a ton of work to be done out there. Here's a slide about RPS targets. Again, more politics over mandates. Mandates being something that you force somebody to do versus setting up a market where you've encouraged good behavior because you've matched people that have money and have desire to fund social benefits to those that can deploy or can install those things in their house. Again, these are one-off programs by and large, and these RPS targets change on sort of 2 to 3, 4-year cycles. There's not a national marketplace for a lot of the things that go underneath these RPS programs. You've got lobbying interests that are that fight against each other. I spent a lot of time actually in Maryland trying to unite the low moderate income programs and Energy Star for homes with solar. And if you're talking about the certificate markets, you've got different types of carbon coming from different types of projects. And needless to say, efficiency and solar lobbies couldn't be reconciled, and the solar effort fell on its face. They didn't get their bills passed. Green button is a concept where meter data becomes accessible. So different types of utility providers will make their data accessible if you have the green button, quote unquote, and you see that it's not ubiquitous. By and large, utilities are very protective of their data, and this is a great blockchain use case in as much as if the utility is in existence to maintain the privacy of homeowner data, then put it into a system where it can be accessible by use case so that all this other funding and marketplace activity can happen without as much administration. Here's just a couple of different corners of the U.S. What if you're a contractor at the center of that circle right there? What if you're a contractor like me here in the D.C. area? We got to work across 5 programs, look at all the programs, on this little regional basis. And then that's expensive to administer for a small business. Like if you have to report program data to up to 3, 5, 7, different types of programs, that's different mechanisms, different methods, different forms, different paperwork. This is just some slides about sort of how wholesale and distribution of energy is somewhat fragmented. This is another big use case for blockchain to try and assist with shared ledgers between the utilities that are moving the majority of bulk power around vis-a-vis the utilities that are at the final mile of that wire and delivering it to a homeowner. The concept of P2P, peer-to-peer energy, is more alive in Europe than it will be in America for a while. Europe, and as IBM showed you, they got a couple of consortia going. EnerWeb, or ENER Web, is a consortia of utilities in Europe that is enabling a lot of peer-to-peer stuff. We have to kind of fly through waste. This is a Sankey diagram, and you guys can pull these for sort of any country in the world, but 66% of energy generation is waste. It sucks. Water, not too dissimilar. Energy efficiency is kind of broken between industrial services versus residential versus passenger transport in sort of the big 3 categories. $4 trillion in energy savings from these types of projects across all of these industries since 2000. And the other question is how do you want to 10x that number? These are kind of a ranking of states, the world. Asia Pacific on the bottom, North America green, Europe is yellow, and that's who's consuming energy. I mean, just look at how much energy we're starting to consume relative to where we were in 1950. And sadly, crude oil, coal, and traditional biofuels sort of form the 3 biggest bottoms. Natural gas is the purple one on the 4th. Then you got nuclear, wind, and solar, and other renewables. Just tiny little fractions there on the top still. No surprise here, electricity consumption per capita, with blue being the heaviest. The inverse of that diagram, number of people without access to energy. The same concept is how do you bring new types of programs, new types of projects, new types of microgrids, new types of grid hardware themselves to these types of areas? How do you help Africa leapfrog the telecom, from no landline to mobile? How do you do the same for their energy, decentralization of their energy? India is a country that's got some of the highest population density and has got some of the least access to energy across the world. Worldly carbon markets here with rankings on how everyone's doing. Here's a Botswana-based Sankey diagram. 3/4 of residential generation is waste. 3/4 of all C&I, this is commercial and industrial generation, goes out to waste. At the top, the brown orange thing there is you got biomass, wood burning stuff powering most homes, and the health impacts of burning kerosene and wood to keep yourself warm or to cook inside an unventilated small house stacks up. And then also the quality of light and the amount of education and the amount of violent crime is all also interrelated to these things. Future energy grids need markets. The concept that we're in a developed grid now versus a less developed grid that can start taking on new types of decentralized generation. This is kind of talking about the importance of storage in the energy mix. Resiliency is an entire another concept that is a difficult market to compute. Waste of all these resources is more than 50% in most cases, and waste is bad. And now we're at blockchain here. So we talked with Eugene about some of the positives of blockchain. I have to do some of the same question and answering to folks that we deal business with. It's just a batch of data is what I wanted to talk about. Bitcoins operate on a 10-minute interval. Other networks are working faster. But the concept is that a lot of people have access to this network and can report data in. And so what's in the block? Well, the block's just the last 2 minutes of energy auditor reported data sets. Or the last block is 10 minutes of transactional data that is serving some sort of pocket of industry. This is kind of some fun stuff. You can get these things on the internet, like do you need a blockchain or not? And here's what's going on in the energy sector. Microgrids, connected home, energy storage, are things that are already deployable or ready to go. DERMS, Distributed Energy Resource Management Systems. This is kind of what blockchain should serve. So there's a little error in this diagram from a minute ago. The ability to create new DERMS and DERs is what blockchain should help enable because it can kind of bring funding. Here's a slide on where blockchain has been going, or what's already active, if you will. A lot of it is geared towards decentralized energy, demand response, peer-to-peer trading, and then a little bit of the wholesale shared ledger management. Things that I'm most interested in actually are digital assets and crowdfunding. It connects back to how do you create a new asset and how do you get the crowd to own it and how do you maintain crowd interests. And then let's just running out of time here, looking at less than a minute. A distributed energy resource is something that combines land and project data with meter data. And you need to have sort of two oracles in order, to look stuff up in two different places. And how you get meter data into a blockchain is a political thing with utilities. How do you get project data into a blockchain is a worker consortia-based situation. This was a diagram we wrote a grant against for inter-crowd funding to encourage low-income participation in community solar. I'm a placemat drawing guy. Here's one of my doodles to try and download my brain. The joke also for some blockchain-based technology is proof of work is very energy intensive, and if you were to try and track meter data in the Bitcoin network, for instance, you'd be consuming more electrons just to track the data than actually were produced in the transaction to start with. So proof of stake and new types of blockchain ledgers like IBM's working on Hyperledger are very data efficient and don't burn unnecessary data like proof of work systems. And there's just a whole ocean, I think was the diagram here, in terms of possibilities for what types of data could be enabled with blockchain. I think that Jigar Shah and a few others talk about the amount of wealth opportunities to be generated as we move into a new clean energy economy. And again, you see this diagram again. And I'm going to come close here to, here one little another note, 13 states with homes over 70 years old, ripe for improvement. Community energy and the concept of bringing community dollars or keeping community dollars in to local community projects is usually a locally encouraged type of RFP or county-based incentive. But meanwhile, we need still local projects to have broader access to international or sort of Wall Street type of money. Here's what my research is. It's in the Home Performance Extensible Markup Language, HPXML. It's a data standard for all the fields that go into an energy audit. So if you bring an inspector out or you bring an energy auditor out, we collect hundreds of data fields. We run a simulation. We run all these different ECMs on the cost effectiveness, ROI return on different types of improvements, and we give you back a work scope. That data contains fields that would be very valuable to advertisers and manufacturers in the public healthcare sector. What if Elon Musk could actually make good on his promise to fund all the water filters in Flint, Michigan? Well, energy auditors are inspecting water filters all the time. Other contractors and plumbers there are installing water filters, and then there's also code inspectors that check anything they want. What if Elon Musk's brash claim like that actually could connect to that other network that's running the Energy Star rebate? That's the general concept here, that your home performance data is now, only being really made accessible amongst contractors and quality assurance providers within a local market, whereas what we're trying to do with the next generation of it is to make it accessible to public healthcare system, insurance, real estate, mortgage lenders, appraisers. Appraisers have to collect very similar data to the energy audit. What if the appraiser, though, instead of charging $700 for their appraisal, could spend $25 on a network to pull 50 to 70% of that data down before they even went to the house? Where are advertisers, manufacturers, and Fortune 500 companies that are trying to do corporate sustainability? Where's the ability for them to get into some of this stuff? And then, talking about consensus and common denominators, I think a home is, a very useful common denominator across people. And then, moreover, the energy worker is what we in this industry already have in consensus. So the energy workers already have consensus on building science and how to report a project into their local sponsor. And so we're trying to use the worker as a vector to deploy a blockchain registry that would start tracking just transactionally what HPXML files are being created or when they're being reported. So it's like a timestamping or notary. And who gets to upload a new file or who gets to access an old file, who gets to unpackage the file and go down to a specific line. When we're talking about a $100 rebate in an energy audit, that's typically coming again from policy or local funding. But what if 10 manufacturers could all kick in $10? And what if there was some even more additional selective stuff, like Coca-Cola could only fund $10 on energy audits where homeowners had 2 or more refrigerators? Stuff like this, wild use case stuff is so far downstream, but it comes back to where we are today as needing to at least track when home performance data or files themselves are being authenticated or validated. Here are some examples of scorecards from different types of standards. Again, most of these standards are built upon very similar data sets, but the algorithms and the metrics that generate these scores are all a little bit different. They just display information differently. But again, meanwhile, the raw data about your house isn't changing. Your dining room isn't changing its square footage from one inspection to the next. And the fact that it has to be remeasured every time and so forth just adds to the costs. Here's just one example of utility programs like bragging about how much they did. And a lot of these things are based on single measure versus whole home measures. And I got Langdon here going to take me off. I do. I'm 5 minutes over. This is my last slide. So you didn't think I could do it, but I'm 5 minutes over. Why don't we have all of these companies funding the work I'm talking about? We don't, because there's no interactive method for it. So if you want a copy of this presentation, this is a placemat too. If you want a copy, I've got a few copies with me, but this is what we were trying in 2016 explain to the DOE and the NGOs that run the program. I'm the guy down in the lower left, it's blue, and I see a blockchain has a pyramid. And again, every slice of this pyramid is
3 slides ago,
a batch.
Said it was your last slide.
There you go. It's the last slide. All right.
All right.
All right. So thank you, guys.
How many slides was that?
I think it was 7.